Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar today that's jointly organized by NUS, CITIC, and IPER on pre-bunking fake news about COVID-19 vaccines, an experiment using an online game. All right, just before we begin, just a little bit of a reminder. All our Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars and sessions that we've had, please keep your mic on mute. We do not want to interrupt any of the speakers. And if you have any questions or anything you want to raise, please just put your hands up icon and we'll get to you. So let's talk a little bit more about today's webinar. Well, just as a prelude, we all know that what brought us all here is fake news, right? Our misinformation. And that is the scourge of the modern times. And the thing about fake news is that has always been one of the greatest challenges of our times. Sometimes it amplifies certain risks and blows small issues out of proportion. Like most of us who are here or who have been in Singapore during the pandemic time, we have realized that fake news or misinformation trigger a run on toilet paper or panic buying during the early days of COVID-19. And at other times, instead of amplifying, it downplays certain important actions or certain risks that we need to take or we need to do to basically keep ourselves safe, like, for example, anti-vaccines and so forth, right? So, but the thing about fake news also or misinformation also is that research and the fight against fake news and misinformation brings people together. Right? It requires a collaborative effort. It requires an interdisciplinary approach. And that is why all of us here from different fields, we have policymakers, we have researchers, we have students, we have people from the organizations and companies. It requires a holistic and comprehensive as well as an interdisciplinary collaboration in order to fight fake news or prevent fake news effectively. All right, so without further ado, let me just introduce the two organizers for this particular webinar. Basically, NUS Center for Trusted Internet and the Community. So NUS, or CITIC for short. NUS CITIC is a first of its kind center that integrates social and behavioral science research, digital technologies, data-driven approaches, and policy studies to examine the internet and its societal impact holistically. So the center brings together academics with expertise ranging from computer science and new media to psychology, and also to public policy and law. The research team worked together in projects related to issues pertaining to an accountable World Wide Web. So a truly interdisciplinary approach looking at the impact of digital technologies on humans and societies, particularly with a focus on Singapore and Asian context. And also in collaboration is IPER, or Institute, Lloyd's Register Institute of Public Understanding of and Risk, Public Understanding of Risk, or IPER for short. So basically, IPER is more than a research and public outreach institute. So IPER is imbued with a sense of responsibility to actually catalyze societal change. So with a better understanding of risk, society as a whole will be empowered to make considered decisions. So I guess that's one of the IPER mission. So IPER strives to shed light on some of the most pressing societal matters and close the gap between public perception and empirical evidence through a multidisciplinary and strategic approach. So in collaboration between CITIC and IPER, we have here today a study that has been done by Dr. Catherine Wong. Dr. Catherine. So Dr. Catherine is a research fellow. Let me introduce her. Dr. Catherine is a research fellow at the NUS Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk. She is a sociologist by training, specializing in public and expert risk perceptions in the areas of nuclear energy, climate change, and green finance. She has published extensively on climate and energy, also on socio-ecological transitions and the factors that influence perception-action gaps. So today, she will talk to us about her latest research on one of these factors, which is basically fake news. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Catherine Wong Mei Ling to take the stage and share with us her research. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Ami, for this really nice introduction. So I'm just going to start to share the slides. Share my screen. 1 second. Okay, so everyone can see my slides, yeah? Okay, cool. All right, so thanks everybody for joining us today in this afternoon joint webinar between CITIC and IPUR. As Almi mentioned, I am a research fellow at IPUR. And the study that I'm about to present was a pilot project that was funded by CITIC and also with some additional funding, supplementary funding from IPUR as well. So to give you a bit of background to the study, it was conducted over a period of 1 year. It began in August 2020. Right in the thick of COVID-19 in Singapore. And we concluded this pilot around July this year. So just only just more than a month ago. Now, before I go into this presentation, I need to first introduce you my very, very awesome team that made this project possible. So I am the principal investigator for this project, and I also had 2 co-investigators, including Almi here, who did this, who just gave you the opening remarks from the NUS School of Communications and New Media. And I also had another co-investigator from IPUR, Dr. Olivia Jensen, who is a lead scientist at the Institute specializing in environment and climate change. Now, I also had a really amazing crew of very dedicated research assistants and interns who played a very huge role in the project. So, you know, Ami mentioned earlier that, you know, to address the problem of fake news, we really need to have a very interdisciplinary approach. And I can tell you this project was interdisciplinary inside and outside of the project. So we had, as you can see, we had a research assistant, Erin Sia from the Department of Computer Science, who helped to create the gaming platform that we used for the experiment. We also had Cindy To from the NUS Department of Sociology, who helped to co-develop the game content and also with the implementation of the experiment itself. And from IPUR, we had Hazel Tay, who recently graduated from the Department of Geography from NUS, who helped with the focus group discussions and some of the earlier stages of the qualitative coding analysis. And we also had Yuan Yuan, who was an intern with IPUR and is currently doing her PhD at also the School of Communication and New Media, who who helped a lot with the quantitative analysis. So the study touched on 2 subject areas. So the first was to do with fake news and experimenting with a gaming intervention to see if it had any effects on the way players were able to identify fake news. The second subject area that the study touched on was more to do with public perceptions of COVID-19 vaccines and some of the underlying reasons for those perceptions. But for today's webinar, in the interest of time, I will only focus on the first subject area of the gaming intervention and participants' kind of perceptions about fake news and what are the mitigating factors for their concerns. So there's going to be kind of like 3 main parts to the presentation today. I'll start first with a brief context of the research problem, and then I'll talk also, give you a bit of background to the research design, the methods and the tools that we use, so that when I then go into the key findings, it'll make a little bit more sense. So because this is going to be a little bit of a longer session, I'm going to pause after I present some of the methods section to give some time for some clarification questions. If anybody has any clarification questions about the methods or the tools that we use, before I then go into the key findings, just to break things up a little bit because it's a bit of a long session. All right, so if you look at the countermeasures against fake news that are out there today, you would see that they broadly fit into 3 categories. The first one is regulatory. So, you know, you have various governments pass new laws, various acts and legislation to kind of deter people from posting disinformation or misinformation online. Then the second category has to do with social media content labeling. So you have social media like Twitter that posts, that would flag when you encounter a tweet that has been disputed to say that this content that you're about to read has been disputed. They also have some red flags. Sometimes if you want to try and share a tweet before actually reading the link or the content that you're sharing, they would also give you a little bit of an alert to say, would you like to read this content before you tweet it? The third category of countermeasures against fake news falls under fact checking, where you have both government and non-governmental websites that provide corrective information to debunk fake news. Now, these countermeasures are for the most part based on the idea of reactive refutation by debunking fake news after it appears in the public domain. And these approaches or these measures are largely underpinned by the question of how can we reduce the exposure to fake news? Now, there's already quite a lot of growing number of studies to show that, you know, debunks don't work as well as we would like them to, because they don't reach as far and as fast enough. You know, they don't go global. So they don't go viral or sometimes even global the way that fake news does. There are also studies that have found, you know, even when you correct misinformation, sometimes it's ineffective. And you know, there are a growing number of studies that use experimental methods as well that have found that people continue to rely on false information that had already been debunked. And in some cases, people even increase their belief in misinformation after being presented the correction. So in this study, we wanted to take a slightly different approach to the problem of fake news by asking, how can we increase people's resilience against fake news? And we do this by experimenting with the use of a fake news game as a pre-bunking tool, which is based on the idea of more preemptive refutation as opposed to reactive refutation. Now, I don't want to go too much into the theoretical discussion in this presentation, but I think it's important to explain a little bit about the basic conceptual anchor for our research design. So this approach is based, the approach that we use in this study is based on the theory of social inoculation. And it was first popularized in the field of social psychology back in 1964 by Professor William McGuire and his colleagues. And they were mainly interested in interventions that enable people to develop a healthy resistance to persuasion by propaganda. So, you know, back in the 1960s, there wasn't like social media and instant messaging platforms. So a lot of the work in this area of social inoculation was very much focused on propaganda. And so since the 60s, this theory has more recently been revived and reapplied to the problem of fake news and online dis and misinformation. Now, in a nutshell, the theory argues that it is possible to inoculate individuals against fake news by preemptively exposing them, exposing individuals with a weakened version of a misleading piece of information. And when you do this, this will then trigger a thought process that is very much similar to the cultivation of mental antibodies, which will then render immunity to the individual to subsequent exposures to fake news. So by preemptively exposing people to a weakened version of fake news, it is possible to help individuals to then develop an attitudinal resistance against mis and disinformation. So based on this theoretical foundation, we designed our research around these three main sets of research questions. The first one is, of course, is the fake news game as an intervention or a treatment able to increase people's ability to identify online mis or disinformation? Then the second set of questions examine more specific effects of the game, such as whether the effects of the intervention have narrow spectrum effects or broad spectrum effects. What does this mean? Okay, so in the game itself, we made the fake news game about COVID-19 vaccines. And in the pre-game test, fake news test, and the post-game fake news test, and I'll go a little bit more into this later on. We gave our participants fake news test questions that were both about COVID-19 vaccines and about other topics. So to have a narrow spectrum effect would mean that participants would get better at identifying fake news only about COVID-19 vaccines. And to get a broad spectrum effect would mean that participants will be able to identify fake news, not just about COVID-19 vaccines, but more broadly about all the other topics as well. Now, we also then wanted to see whether there were intergenerational differences or gender differences in the results that we identified both in the game, the questionnaire, as well as the focus group discussions. And the third set of questions were more around participants' concerns about fake news and what were the mitigating factors for those concerns. So now, just some quick definitional issues. In the study, we took a broad definition of fake news to refer to both misinformation, which is simply information that's false or incorrect, and this can also include human error, misreporting, for example, as well as disinformation, which is misinformation, but with a deliberate intent to deceive the audience. So to answer these research questions, we use a mixed methods approach, which combined experimental tools, so like the gaming intervention with the fake news quizzes, as well as questionnaires and a focus group discussion with the treatment group after playing the game. Now, let me give you a little bit more detail about these instruments. So in the game itself, it was designed to get players to role play as one of 4 fake news characters that have been identified in the literature. So the first character is called the alarmist, and the alarmist is somebody who tries to make a very small issue look very big. So like the amplification effects that Naomi kind of mentioned in his opening remarks. And the denier is somebody who does the opposite. So the denier will try to like downplay the severity of a topic and make it look small and insignificant. Then the third character is called a clickbait monger, and clickbait monger is somebody who tries to write up a piece of a story to get as many clicks as possible. So that person would typically try to sensationalize a story, imply scandal, and usually write an article around somebody famous or a famous organization or company. And the fourth character is called a conspiracy theorist, who is somebody who distrusts any kind of like mainstream narrative and would try to convince his or her reader to also distrust the government and official institutions and official narratives of a particular issue. So there were these 4 characters in the game. Now, in each of these characters, each of them use a combination of 5 deception techniques. So the first one is impersonation, and impersonation is a technique where the content producer would try to pose as a real person, like a doctor, a physician, an epidemiologist, or it could also be mainstream media. So to pretend to be a trusted voice of authority. The second deception technique is the use of emotional content, where the content producer tries to play into people's basic emotions, try to get them to empathize with them, or to instigate fear or anger and outrage when reading the content. The third deception strategy is called polarization, where the writer then tries to expand in his or her writing to expand the political gap between the left and the right, or the pro and against, basically to drive people away from the political center or to a more balanced centrist dialogue about a particular issue. The fourth category is called conspiracy, which is spreading the belief that unexplained events, like COVID-19 is orchestrated by a covert group, whether it's a deep state conspiracy or Bill Gates trying to insert chips into our brains. So that's the kind of strategy that the conspiracy theorists would use in this type of writing. And the fifth deception strategy involves the use of discrediting opponents by attacking the source of criticism deflections. So like casting doubt about, the expertise of, medical experts or public health officials or even government spokespersons. So in the game itself, participants were tasked with creating a fake news article about COVID-19 vaccines. And the idea was to expose all of them to these 5 deception techniques that I just mentioned by using the game. So let me just give you an idea of what it looks like, right? So depending on how many people signed up for the game for that day, we would have either individual players or players playing in groups of between 2 to 5 players at each time. And they will be assigned one of the 4 characters. So the alarmist, the denialist, clickbait monger, or the conspiracy theorist in the game. So on the day itself, they would be given a sign-in name, a username to sign in. And you would see that here we have English and Chinese. We actually translated the game into Mandarin as well, because we wanted to see whether language had a role to play in the effects, but we didn't manage to get enough Chinese speaking players. So we only had English. We mainly used the English version of the game. So on the day itself, they would get the name, they sign in, play, and this is what they will see. So there'll be like a demo video to give them like a context for what this game is about, how the game goes. And so the task is to create an article about COVID-19 vaccines. And there are 8 sections to this article. So you can jump back and forth to the various sections based on by clicking on the numbers below. Now, so in this case, this particular player was assigned the character of an alarmist. And if you want to see what all the other characters are, you can click on characters here, which would then take you to this kind of screen, drop down screen, which would give you, again, the kind of a reminder for what your goal is as an alarmist compared to the denier, clickbait monger, and conspiracy theorist is further down below the screen. So this is the first section of the article, because it's number 1 here, and it tells you that this is the title. So each of the teams or players were given 30 minutes to finish the game. So there was a bit of a time pressure there. And these are the different texts that they would be given to kind of choose. So based on my character as an alarmist, which of these titles best suits the character of an alarmist? And so then this will basically be repeated across all the different sections of the article. When I choose one, and then I click next, it'll take me to the next section. So after I finish clicking on all the choosing text for all 8 sections, I can do an overview by clicking on article, which would take me to this screen here, which would then give me an overview of all the text that I have chosen. And you would notice that each of these tags actually, as I mentioned earlier, uses one or a combination of the 5 deception strategies that fake news producers use. So this here is some examples of the fake news test questions that we gave to participants before and after playing the game. Now, participants won't see this part, but what they would see is the stimuli and then a timer. So we wanted to simulate as much as possible the way people consume information or news on their mobile phones and on social media. So we gave them a time limit of 1 minute maximum, so they don't have too much time to think about it. Look at the stimuli, 1 minute maximum to answer whether is this news bite mostly true or mostly false. And so in each test, there were 10 questions, and then we scored them out of 10. Oh, sorry, the other thing I need to mention is that in the fake news test, we had a mixture of true questions, so-called true news and fake news. So this is the sequence of the experimental protocol that we use. So as I mentioned, we had a pre-game fake news test, which was also combined with a short questionnaire. And then we gave on the gaming day itself, they would either play the game in groups or individually on Zoom. Everything was done online. And then this would then be followed by a second fake news test and another slightly longer questionnaire, followed by the focus group discussion, all of which were done on Zoom. Now for the treatment group, they were given also a sustainability test a few days later to see whether the effects of the game were sustained or if it kind of like waned. Just to talk a little bit more about the focus group discussions, we conducted a semi-structured discussion, which means we asked all the groups the same questions about what were their key learning points from the game, what were their biggest concerns about fake news, and any mitigating factors for those concerns. We also asked them whether they had any perceived upsides of fake news to get an idea of what was kind of like the appeal of fake news to our participants. So we had in the focus group discussion, we didn't do any recordings. We just had note takers to note down the discussion. And then the transcripts were then manually coded in a software called MaxQDA, where we used a combination of structural coding, which is top-down research-driven, and affective coding, which is bottom-up data-driven, that would then reveal to us the range of major and minor themes that represent the subjective perceptions and learning points from our participants in the treatment group. So you'll see all of this later in the key findings. So just to give you an overview of our sample, we had a total of 122 participants. We had 68 participants in the treatment group and 54 in the control group, which you can see on the left side of the boxes. So you can also see from here, we have mostly more females than males in both the treatment group and the control group. All our participants were Singaporeans or permanent residents. And also in terms of age differences, you can also see that a large majority of both our treatment group and control group were millennials. We had much fewer Gen X and boomers. Now, just to note, why do we call Gen X and boomers? So Gen X so we basically had, I think, only like a handful of participants who were between the ages of 60 and 79. So we decided then to just put them together with the Gen X participants sample, especially for the quantitative analysis. So that's why so Gen X and boomers are participants between the ages of 40 and 79, and the millennials are between the ages of 21 and 39. Now, you can see also in terms of the education level, most of our participants were fairly highly educated, with a large majority of our participants having university or higher education. And also in terms of religion, it very much reflects the recent census, national census that was done in Singapore. So I'm just going to move on now to the key findings. Okay, so the first thing that we wanted to find out was whether the game was effective in increasing people's ability, the players' ability to identify fake news, right? So as I mentioned in answering Shane's question earlier, we couldn't run a paired t-test because the test questions were different. So we ran a covariance analysis, and we didn't find a statistically significant association. So which means that the treatment was not a significant factor in influencing the post-game test score after controlling for the pre-game test score. But this is not particularly surprising because our sample was very, very small, right? So as I mentioned earlier, we only had like 122 participants. This is treatment and control group combined. And in another study using a very similar experiment protocol. And so this answers, I think, one of Damien's question about whether this study is the game is original. This is, if you want, you can go and look up this study. So they use the same kind of experimental protocol, but using a slightly different game design. but also on the subject of COVID-19. And these guys had like more than 700 participants, and they also failed to find a significant effect. And it was only after they increased the sample size to more than 1,500 participants that they started to then see a small but significant interaction start to emerge between the treatment condition and the truth discernment. So the lack of a statistically significant effect in our small pilot is not, it's really, I wouldn't read too much into it or put too much weight on it, because we really do need to have a much bigger sample to have draw any statistically robust conclusions from it. But we did find other very interesting stuff. So when we look at the test scores itself, and I think on this should answer your question, what we found was that the treatment and the control groups were actually relatively good at discerning between real and fake news, regardless of the intervention, right? So the figure that you see, figure 2 on the left-hand side here, shows you the average test scores for treatment group, which is the turquoise color, and the control group, which is the green bar. So, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I mentioned. So the control group didn't play the game. They only did the test and the questionnaire, whereas the treatment group did everything, the pre-test, and then the pre-game test, the gaming intervention, and then the post-game tests. So you see here, the numbers here reflect the mean average score of all the participants in the control group and all the participants in the treatment group. And you see that, you know, they scored quite well, relatively well. In both the pre-game and the post-game test. Now you will see that the mean scores in the post-game fake news test was a bit lower than the pre-game test, but this doesn't necessarily mean that participants got worse because of the game, right? Because you can see, like, you know, both the control group and the treatment group got worse. So I think it's more an indication that the post-game test was a little bit more difficult than the pre-game test, and you know, again, this is the reason why we run pilots, because we need to learn all these things to identify how to better tweak the design of our instruments. Then we also looked at whether more people got true questions correct in the fake news test after playing the game, and so this is the figure that you see here in figure 3. So here we found that in the pre-game test, the results were very, very mixed. So because the results were very mixed, I didn't want to confuse you. I didn't put the results out here. But what you see here is the post-game test results for the true questions. And we found that the control group had more true questions correct. So the control group are the green bars. So there were 3 kind of like true questions in the post-game test, and the control group had more of those, a higher percentage of the control group answered the true questions correct. So the numbers here mean that, so almost 41% of the control group answered the first true question correct, compared to just over 35% of the treatment group. And then this is the same for the other 2 true questions in the post-game test. So this could suggest that after playing the game, among the treatment group, there was a higher level of suspicion among the treatment group. Now, remember earlier I mentioned the 5 deception techniques used by fake news producers. In our fake news test, we included questions that use each of these 5 techniques. So when we then compared which of these techniques were the most effective at deceiving our participants, both in the treatment and control group, we found that impersonation was the one that most of our participants fell for. So these numbers that you see here show indicate that for all the questions that use impersonation as a deception strategy, just under 50% of our total sample answered it correctly. And then you, and then you compare that with the other questions that use like emotional content as a deception strategy, polarization, or conspiracy, etc., you know, quite a high percentage of our sample got them correct. So between 75% to you know, around 82-83% of our sample answered them correctly. So for the research question about narrow spectrum or broad spectrum effects, again, we ran a covariance analysis and we didn't find any significant effects on the test scores for both the vaccine related questions, so narrow spectrum effects, or the non-vaccine related questions. In terms of the test scores itself, we didn't find any significant intergenerational or gender differences in participants' ability to identify fake news. So, what this says is that it really runs counter to some of the common perceptions, both in our study and I think also more in general among our participants, that you know, older people are more vulnerable to fake news or younger people are more vulnerable to fake news. Actually, we didn't find any empirical evidence to support this common perception. And participants, what we saw in the data was that participants across all ages and both genders were really equally good or bad at identifying fake news. But what we did find was some interesting gender and intergenerational differences in the questionnaire and the qualitative coding results. So one dimension of the intergenerational difference is in terms of the level of confidence. So in the post-game questionnaire, we asked participants, how good do you think you are at identifying fake news, a fake news post or a fake news article, right? And so you see the results here in figure 4. These were the stated levels of confidence that our participants indicated by age group. So the millennials are in blue and the Gen X and boomers are in green. And you see that almost 60% of millennials felt that they were either somewhat good or very good at detecting fake news, compared to just only above 50% for Gen X and boomers. Now, then we compared this with the fake news test scores for both the control and treatment groups, and we found some very mixed results. So in the pre-game fake news tests, participants who indicated a higher level so that's the red bar here, a high level of confidence, they did worse in the first fake news test compared to participants who indicated a very low level of confidence, which is the blue bars here. So this is the kind of like the average score. For all the participants who indicated that I'm very bad at identifying fake news, they actually did really well in the first test. But then when it came to the post-game test, this trend was completely reversed. And we saw that participants who had indicated a low level of confidence in identifying fake news then scored worse. And then the ones who were really confident, they really excelled in the post-game fake news test, as well as in the sustainability test. But bearing in mind that the sustainability test was only done by the treatment group and not the control group. So these results are quite interesting. They run counter to some of the studies that have been done in the UK and the US that found, you know, people with high levels of confidence tend to do quite badly at differentiating between real and fake news. But, you know, again, we need to take this with a lot of caution because as I mentioned earlier, our sample is really small. So we do need to have a much larger sample to really say that there's a strong, robust finding here. Now, in the qualitative data set, we also found some interesting intergenerational and gender differences in terms of the key learning points that our participants took away from the game itself. So most of the participants across all the age groups found that the introduction to the 4 characters, so, you know, the clickbait monger, conspiracy theorist, alarmist, and denialist, they found these 4 characters kind of like the idea that stuck the most in their minds. And they found that it was a good framework for identifying the intent of fake news content and the use of deception techniques. So some of them also kind of like indicated, oh, you know, after playing the game, when I did the test, we could see, oh, this one sounds very clickbaity and is therefore most likely to be fake. We also found that only female participants made some kind of comments that indicated a level of self-reflexivity from playing the game. So, you know, a number of them, and this was across generations. So both Gen XB and millennial females noted that the game made them question how they have been consuming news, you know, about current affairs, or, you know, even entertainment, more frivolous types of content, and kind of, you know, that the game made them to think about the foundations of their background knowledge. The other interesting thing we found was that the millennials, both male and female, were very stuck on some of the semantic techniques that was being used in the game by the different characters, and that was a particular learning point for them. Especially some of the key signifiers that they kind of repeated back to us in the focus group discussion. So, like, you know, things like, you know, being more aware about the word choices, the shock factor, exaggeration. When someone uses words like collusion, it should like raise flags in their minds. That it could potentially be polarizing or a conspiracy theorist type of article. Now, the fourth kind of dominant theme that we found in the qualitative data in terms of the effects and the key learning points from the game was fact-checking. And this was mentioned only by millennial participants. But I do have to highlight that despite this being a dominant theme for millennials, almost none of them used the fact-checking function in the game. And we did have a fact-checking function in the game for them to check, you know, whether the information was correct or not. A handful of our participants did use the fact-checking function, but this was only after they were like prompted by the moderators. And even the ones that did use the fact-checking function, they didn't click on the link. So in every corrective information that in the fact-checking list that we had in the game, we included the link as the source for the corrective information, and nobody clicked on the link to check that the source was actually a reliable source. So, you know, okay, we don't want to read too much into this. It could really be a function of the game setting itself that, you know, their players are under time pressure. And so they therefore didn't really have time to think about fact checking. But it could also indicate some degree of disconnect in that, you know, in theory, they do recognize fact checking is a very important part of defending against protecting themselves against fake news. But in practice, very few of them actually do so. And some of our participants even did allude to the fact that, yes, they know fact checking is important, but, you know, everyone has busy lives, and they don't always have time to do fact checking. Now, when it comes to the question about participants' perceptions about fake news and what mitigates their concerns, we also then started to see a bit more pronounced gender and intergenerational differences start to emerge. Okay, so what you see here is the qualitative coding results for the participants' concerns about fake news from the focus group discussion. So before we started coding, we segmented our transcripts by gender and by age group. So that's so you see here Gen X and Boomers. We had all the transcripts for the 60 to 79 participants. 40 to 79 participants, and the millennials who were 21 to 39. And then we also separated them by gender, males and females. And we did that because that's how we then compare similarities and differences in the emergent themes from the coding exercise itself. So what you see underneath here are the range of themes that reflect the concerns that were brought up during the focus group discussion by the different categories, right? And the dots here on the right-hand side indicate to you the coding frequency. So every time there's a segment of the transcript that refers to difficulty in discerning real from fake news, that text is coded to this, and it will be recorded as 1. And so the more frequently participants refer to these different themes, the larger the dots will be. And just to give you an indication of what the dots, the coding frequencies that the dots represent, these really small ones, they represent about 1 to 2 coding frequencies, so 1 to 2 segments of text in the transcript. The medium-sized ones are between 8 to 9, and the large ones are about like 13 to 14 coding frequencies. Now, the other thing you would notice is also that there's a lot more themes for the millennials compared to the Gen X boomers. Now, this is also, remember, we had way more millennials than Gen X boomers in our sample. So that's why that's also a function of that. But at the same time, it's, for the Gen X boomers, we had more females than males, and yet the males seem to be a lot more vocal than females. So we did get more coding emergent themes or coding results from the Gen X boomer males compared to the females. Let me see, did I cover everything here? Okay, yes. So overall, you can see here that the millennials express a wider range of concerns about fake news. But then when we went and looked into, what were participants actually saying when they said, oh, they're concerned about social polarization, for example, these concerns, that emergent concerns, were mainly directed at other people rather than themselves. And you can see here that only millennials mentioned in the discussion that they're not exposed or vulnerable to fake news. Compared to Gen X boomers, you don't see that theme here because nobody mentioned that. And also, if you look at who they considered to be vulnerable to fake news, again, you see that they mainly see fake news as a problem for old people and uneducated people or poorly educated people. So millennials, from this, it kind of indicates to us that millennials had a general tendency to underestimate their own exposure to fake news and their own resilience, and also to overestimate their ability to identify mis and disinformation. And so here are some example quotes from the text, the transcripts, where millennial participants tended to think that, young people are more woke, and then they would check. But, as we had seen in the gaming time, they didn't really check. And then there was one very cute participant who was very upset with his mom for sharing fake news to him during COVID-19. She told him that Zara was going to close down because of COVID-19, and that they were going to have these big discounts. And so he then shared that misinformation with all his friends, but it turned out to be fake news. So now, if you look at the themes identified by Gen X boomer females, we also noticed that the Gen X and boomer females were mainly concerned with individual level factors directed at their own ability to discern fake news. Real news from fake news. So they talked a lot about, their own difficulty in discerning, and also their inability to respond correctly to fake news or mis or disinformation. Whereas Gen X B males were much more concerned about like societal level effects, so like social polarization, who determines the truth, narrative domination. And they were relatively less concerned about individual factors or their own vulnerability. So like, things like not being able to discern was their own ability to discern, or not having time to discern, or becoming an accidental conduit for sharing fake news was only a very minor theme among the Gen X males. as I said earlier, millennials express a wider range, and in particular, they were quite concerned about themes that had to do with the breakdown of society. So like social polarization, and having an incorrect response to risk. So let's see. Yeah, I think for millennials, this is kind of like the main thing that I wanted to highlight, that they were quite concerned about the polarization effects of fake news. Now, then we also wanted to know what were the mitigating factors for these concerns. And both in the questionnaire and focus group discussion data, we found that trust in government and trust in mainstream media were kind of like the key mitigating factors for both groups. So you see for females, trust in government; for Gen X boomer males, trust in mainstream media. They also mentioned a bit about their own social network being a mitigating factor for their concerns about fake news. And then when it comes to millennials, trust in public information was kind of one of the main dominant themes, and this includes mainstream media, information from government websites, research papers, and also other official sources of information. But at the same time, this was very local based, right? So there was also quite a lot of doubt expressed towards Western media. So they don't trust Western media so much compared to our local mainstream media. And then for the males, media literacy was also referred to as a key mitigating factor. And they talked about this in terms of having a combination of cognitive and social practice elements. So like, having the intuition, critical thinking, but also knowing how to check the background of the information, cross-referencing and following digital trails and all that to find contradiction or one-sided biases. So now these coding results were also corroborated by the questionnaire data. And so we found in the questionnaire, we asked, we gave participants a statement that most of the news from CNA or the Straits Times is accurate, and we asked them to indicate whether they strongly agree or strongly agree or strongly disagree. And you can see here that most of the answers were around somewhat agree or strongly agree. And then also we asked them a range of questions that would give us an indication of how much they trusted the government. This is just one of the questions. The Singapore government is well prepared for future crises in general. And you can see that also quite a large percentage of them, both in the millennials and Gen X boomers, answered that they somewhat agree or strongly agree that the government is well prepared for future crises. Now, lastly, we also wanted to know what was the appeal of fake news to our participants in the focus group discussion. So we asked them, do you see any upsides to fake news? And so these two circles here represent the results from that coding. Now, these two circles do not represent the same value, right? So what you see here is a coding frequency of 7, and this circle represents a coding frequency of 22. So 22 texts being coded. So they're not, just remember, they're not the same. But what the more important message to communicate from these circles is what the dominant themes are. So for Gen X Bs, the appeal of fake news to them was mainly in terms of getting exposure or access to multiple perspectives about a particular topic or issue. Also, information to inspire critical thinking, and also as an expression of freedom of speech. Whereas for millennials, this was more in terms of actively seeking for alternative views. And also that, they do quite enjoy the creativity in so-called fake news, as well as the humor. But this is assuming that they know that is fake news. And also that the presence of fake news and the need for governments to then come up and debunk those pieces of mis and disinformation actually helps to foster greater transparency, because governments then need to come and say, actually, this is what's actually happening. Actually, this is the data that debunks what this particular post or article claims. So these are the main appeal factors of fake news. All right, so to recap very quickly, we saw some indication that participants became more suspicious of information in the post-game fake news test, with fewer of them in the treatment group getting the true questions correct compared to the control group. The question came up in one of our earlier workshop discussions about whether this is an indication of lower levels of confidence resulting from the game, or whether it's higher levels of suspicion. And I don't think our current data set allows us to make that difference at the moment. But what we also saw was that the level of confidence that there was a significant association between the level of confidence and the change in test scores, with participants with a higher level of confidence doing better in the post-game and sustainability tests. We also saw that impersonation was the most successful deception technique, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. And we also saw some intergenerational and gender differences, in particular with millennials expressing a wider range of concerns, but also some level of complacency in that they felt fake news was a more problem for older people and lower educated people. And overall, we saw that our participants had quite a high level of awareness. But again, I think there's some self-selecting bias in our sample here, so we have to be aware of that. But there was also a sense that we saw in our data that our participants didn't think that Singapore is really impacted by fake news, and that the severe impacts are more something that's happening overseas rather than here. And this relates to our fifth finding, that there was a high level of trust in English media and also trust in government, which were the key mitigating factors against fake news. And finally, that the appeal of fake news, especially for millennials, was in seeking this alternative views and creativity. So last slide, what does all of this mean? Now, so one of the pinch points that was raised in the expert workshop that we had a few weeks ago was that, the relatively high level of complacency, especially among the well-educated, the younger parts of our population, was a bit of a concern. And we saw in the qualitative analysis that, millennials considered media literacy as a key mitigating factor against fake news, but they still struggled to find, with some of the fake news questions, especially the ones that use impersonation as a deception technique. So we really need to have a media literacy education that really emphasizes falsehoods, that uses impersonation as a deception technique. And to help the public internalize some of the key signifiers from online disinformation that present themselves as legitimate news media or legitimate, experts or scientists, especially the ones that try to look like ST or CNA. We also need to explore how social networks can be used as a defense mechanism against fake news and a source of corrective information, because we've seen quite clearly in our data that and also in other studies, people don't really fact check very often. But so I think we really need to explore how the social media itself, our social networks itself, can be a source of corrective information. Now, so in addition to that, I think our media literacy campaign also needs to emphasize an etiquette for correcting fake news within our social networks and social media, particularly in shifting away from a culture of shaming or canceling people to a culture of learning, where we don't insult or shame our friends for accidentally sharing fake news, but that we actually use those moments as a learning point. And finally, when you look at the other deception techniques used by fake news producers, so polarization, emotional language, conspiracy, and discrediting opponents, these strategies exploit one common element, and that is the hierarchy of knowledge and the sense that some voices are being silenced by the dominant discourse or the powers that be. So we really need to address this and have an open discussion that allows the public to develop a healthy skepticism about what they're reading, and not just, you know, in social and alternative media, but also mainstream media. And to do so in a way that would allow them to come to their own conclusion about why some views, despite having some truth in them, may not be the best for society or may even be harmful. So I think with these 4 ingredients, we can become then a more resilient society when it comes to the proliferation of misinformation or disinformation. And with this, I will end here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Catherine. Awesome study, very in-depth. And if I may just say something before we move on to the Q&A. As you all would know, this is a pilot study done by Catherine and the team, largely led by Catherine. And as a pilot study, there are 2 very important qualities or important findings from the study, in that you actually combined an experimental and triangulated it with a qualitative focused group interviews or in-depth interviews. I think that's a remarkable aspect of a study by itself. And secondly, it opens up more questions and directions than, you know, it is conclusive. So I think it's an amazing study, and I think the questions are coming in basically based on, you know, the kind of interesting findings that and novel too that you have found from this particular pilot study. So I'll be handling the Q&A. So please keep the questions coming either through the chat or raise your hands in the Zoom, or just find an opportune moment for you to speak up. So without further ado, let's go into the Q&A. I think we have to revert back to Ang's question, and I think you'll be able to answer it. So Ang actually asked, did anyone believe more in the fake news before and after the treatment? So I think you already answered it in a way by your presentation, but perhaps you can just briefly answer Ang this question. Yep.
Yeah, so I think the results were quite mixed. As you saw, the post-game test scores came down, right? So the participants actually did a little bit worse in the post-game test, and part of it is because they answered more of the true questions wrongly. So I would say that the results itself is inconclusive. We cannot say whether they got better at identifying the false news after playing the game, but they actually got worse at identifying the correct news after playing the game.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Another 2 questions by Punchol Shin. So 2 questions about sample and hypothesis. May I ask what made your sample size small? Is there any specific reasons perhaps on why you kept your sample size small? And is there any reason for that when you designed this experiment? So that's the first question. Second, can you please help him or her recall your main hypothesis? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I will tackle the first question first. Why was our sample size so small? It was purely because we did. It's the limitations of our own personal network. So in this study, we used convenient sampling and then combined with snowballing and some random sampling, because we didn't have a budget to hire a recruitment agency to do a nationally representative sample. So we were mainly recruiting participants from my own network and my RA's network and Elmi's network. And then going from there and trying to get more of their friends to sign up to join the study. So and then the third strategy that we used was we actually, my RA actually got onto this Telegram group called SG Research Lobang, where we then recruited quite a number of our participants through that. So that's why our sample was very small. It wasn't by design at all. We would have loved to get a larger sample. The second question, to remind you the hypothesis. So the hypothesis was that the intervention, the gaming intervention, would be effective in increasing players' ability to identify fake news, and that would be indicated by higher game score. So that was the opening hypothesis. But you know, as you know, with research, right, we often start with a certain starting point, and then when you actually implement it, all these other things come up, and you have to also be adaptive to the data, to the research participants' response to the instruments itself. And so that's why we then found all these other really interesting things.